Research shows that most, in a business context, most change initiatives fail, and which is quite remarkable, because when you think of the intent, when you think of the resources that go into it, the majority of desirable change actually fails to materialize. And the research suggests that the biggest reason why that is the case is that the loss inherent within the change is not adequately addressed. So typically what happens in a business is the leaders see the change that is needed and start to engage with it, start to position it, start to look at what this means for us as an organization. And then it gets to the point, after they've had this long engagement with what the change is going to be, where they roll it out to the troops, if you like, and they go enthusiastically into the business to say, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we're going to become. And they often get a very muted response, or even some resistance. And at that point, they're often a little bit bemused. But can't you see the benefits? And what they forget to realize at that moment is that they have had this long introduction to the change. They've had the ability to adapt, to adjust, to think through it. They buff it up, they shine it up, and they present it as a fait accompli to the business and expect the business just to embrace it. And it's that failure to address the sense of loss that people feel when confronted with the change. Now, loss might mean I need to move from this department to that department, but in my former department, my voice is heard. I have credibility, I have trust. A loss might be a change in routine. A loss might be letting go of a particular skill set or knowledge base that I've relied on, because now I'm going to have to relearn. So it's multifaceted, but the failure to address loss, because somehow as humans we just are hardwired that when confronted with change, the first default question is, what's it going to cost me? What am I going to lose? And the failure to address that adequately, not just to gloss over it, is perhaps the biggest mistake leaders make in change initiatives or change management processes. So I think there's a whole lot of regulatory things that need to be complied with depending on what sector. So let's take that as a given, that there are certain rules and processes that will always guide the policy. But within that, I think good governance is a type of governance that encourages the companies or the sector to experiment, to grow, to try new things, to challenge assumptions, to not always accept the standard orthodoxies that exist because we've been doing it this way for 20 years. So good governance for me is the type of governance that says we are living in a changing world, which means that change is ubiquitous, change is constant. Now, what will it take to build a successful company in that context? And I think there's a whole lot. That's the work that I've been doing here all day in this program. I think it's understanding the changing context and how to thrive in the midst of that. And it starts with good governance. And if the governance body is themselves demonstrating curiosity, themselves demonstrating an appetite for learning, for experimentation, then that will cascade into the organization. So that for me is good governance within the constraints that every industry has.
It's not easy though, it requires...
Hugely difficult. Definitely not easy. Much easier said than done. But there are starting points, and starting points for me would be the mind shift. So I was saying to somebody involved in a board recently that how many questions get asked in your board meeting? And he stopped and he thought a bit and he said, well, I don't really know. And I said, well, why don't you perhaps keep a record at your next board meeting? Just keep a piece of paper next to you and count. And he came out of the board meeting stunned, because in the entire board meeting, I think there were 2 or 3 questions that had been asked. And he said, the obvious, that's clearly not enough. And I agreed with him. And so there we started to discuss an initiative, an experiment, if you like, as to how he could elicit more questions. Because again, good governance, good leadership today understands that they need to ask better questions. And those questions invite participation, invite the wisdom in the room, the diversity present into the room. So yeah, that... Every year, the United Nations puts out a job report, and in 2023, for this year, the report listed 5 particular skill sets that they believe leaders or organizations are going to need in the next 5 years. And if I remember correctly, there was analytical reasoning, which is no surprise. There was curiosity, which is a big surprise. There was resilience and grit. There was emotional intelligence. And the 5th one was, what was the 5th one? Creativity. I can't remember the 5th one. But the point is that the jobs that are currently entrenched today are probably not going to be sufficient by way of the skill sets for the world that is emerging. And this again becomes a real leadership development agenda. It becomes a huge agenda for companies. What are you measuring and why? And very often companies are measuring the wrong things. They're measuring on an old skill set, but wishing for more innovation or more creativity. And the problem is, until they find a metric as to how to do that, they're probably not going to get that behavior. So besides the overall headline of what do leaders need, they need to be adaptable. And underpinning adaptability are things like the ability to learn, unlearn and relearn, the ability to innovate and be creative and not be afraid of experimentation. A critical one is emotional intelligence. And so emotional intelligence is built of 5 stepping stones, if you like. The theory of emotional intelligence by Goldman and others says that EQ is based on self-awareness. And as you become self-aware, you have the ability to regulate your own behavior. You then have the ability also to connect with others, social skills. It is something that then leads to intrinsic motivation. You don't have to have external motivation. You know, because you have a sense of purpose and drive, you motivate yourself. And lastly, it leads to empathy. So when you talk about EQ, leaders need EQ, what you're talking about is self-awareness, the ability to regulate your own behavior, the ability to connect or social skills, intrinsically motivate yourself, and empathy. We believe that you lead out of who you are. And so the real question that follows that is, well, then who is the self that leads? Leadership has become something of character. It's not just a list of skills that you need. Yes, that's important, but people follow people. And so the character ethic of leadership has become so much more important in the equation. I don't think you can be a successful 21st century leader without doing that inner work of who is the self that leads. And of course, that's a dynamic thing that changes every day throughout your life. But it's that ability to do that inner work. One of the benefits of that I get is I do extensive travel, and so I'm in different environments continually, like in Oman here. And it gives me the ability to ask questions, the ability to observe protocols and behavior, give permission to others to call my behavior when it's not appropriate out, because it might be done with just ignorance, but innocence as well. So tell me when I'm overstepping, tell me when something's not appropriate, because that's the way I learn. So travel becomes a wonderful tool for those who have opportunity to travel into different ethnic and cultural environments to build this kind of self-awareness if they pay attention. Yeah, so a futurist, what does a futurist do? Somebody who intentionally builds capacity to see and understand the implications and meaning of change. And when I think of what might be the biggest change, I think generative AI is probably going to change everything. I was reading just recently an article by Bill Gates. It said in 5 years' time, what we understand by way of computing is going to change completely, because what's likely to happen is that the computer, as it were, will become intelligent in that it will anticipate ahead of time some of our own needs and then position product or position opportunity in front of us. And so we won't need all the apps that we need today. Now think about that for a moment. How many businesses are app businesses that build apps? So you can pretty much get everything you need today, but you have to go into different apps to access the information. The future promises an integrated approach, not this kind of sporadic, separate, and that integrative approach is, I think, going to change pretty much everything. I'm intrigued by your 2040 vision. I think that's wonderful. Again, research shows that countries who have a unifying vision achieve more than anything else. I have been so impressed with what I've seen in my very limited stay. And so keep doing what you're doing, keep growing, keep asking questions, because I think Oman has a huge role to play, not just in the region, but beyond the region. And we've got a world that could do with a lot more of what I have seen and experienced in Oman. So keep doing what you're doing, be curious as a nation, be prepared to grow, and I think the future is incredibly bright.